Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Casual Friday. In this week's Casual Friday podcast, I have tidbits. I have an update on the little sweater I've been knitting, and I have answers to questions about using superwash wool for sweaters. So let's get started. This tidbit is for those of you who enjoyed the state fair video I posted a couple of weeks ago. Every year in September, our guild's program features members who entered the fair and want to share what they submitted and how their items performed in the fair, including what the judges had to say. Well, this year, the September program coincides with Yarn Over, which is our guild's annual conference. Since COVID, we've held our meetings via Zoom and will continue to do that for most months, and we invite anybody who's interested to those programs. This month is an exception in some ways. Join us on Sunday, September 24th at the Crown Plaza, Minneapolis West for our in-person State Fair review and fashion show. We'll be presenting the items on screen as we've done in the last few years, but with the added bonus of being able to see the items and makers in person. The meeting is free and open to all. There's no pre-registration required. If you're not able to join us in person, we will be live streaming the event on Instagram and posting a recording of the presentation on the member dashboard. So that last bit about the member dashboard refers to the Guild's website where members can access past recorded monthly programs. Whether you are or are not a member, you can always look at the Instagram live stream that will remain on our Instagram profile indefinitely. So I'll leave links down below to the Guild's Instagram account and to the website so that you can learn more information about the Guild and its monthly programs or about this specific program. And again, if you miss the live, you'll still be able to see it on Instagram after the fact. This tidbit came to me from Winkwonk on Ravelry. They're doing some research in preparation for a trip to Wales and came across the website of Ffaelynfach, a Welsh blanket making company that uses local wool and natural dyes. On the website is a page of Welsh phrases and greetings as well as idioms. Now, I tried to get Google Translate to pronounce this for me, but it apparently doesn't offer Welsh pronunciations like it does for many other languages. So I'll put the words on the screen while I slaughter the Welsh language. I apologize to any of you Welsh speakers. The phrase is gweill. I know I said that wrong. It means in progress or in the pipeline or in the works, that sort of thing. But the literal translation is, it's on the knitting needles. So I love it. Thanks, Winkwonk. I love watching sheep getting sheared, whether it's in person at a fiber festival or on YouTube videos. I don't get tired of watching it. So this tidbit that I'm sharing with you came from falling down a rabbit hole after reading the book Unraveled, a book I told you about a couple of weeks ago, where this woman during the pandemic decided to learn how to shear a sheep, how to spin the wool, how to dye it using natural dyes, and then design a sweater. She was already a knitter, but she didn't have any of those other skills, and when she did all of those. So when she was talking about learning to shear, she mentioned that the way that most people shear sheep these days is to use a method developed in New Zealand back in, I think, the 1950s by a man named Gordon Bowen. He and his brother Ivan developed this method. And back in the 50s, he had the world record for sheep shearing. He sheared like 456 sheep in 9 hours, which is on average 70 seconds per sheep. So like I said, I like to watch people shear sheep, and I watch this woman, Right Choice Shearing, on YouTube, and I've seen her shear in this method many, many times. But she's not that fast. When I go to fiber festivals, they're not that fast. Now, to be fair, a lot of times they're explaining what they're doing or they're talking through it, but they're just not doing it in like a minute flat. And it was after watching this and then reading a Wikipedia article about Gordon Bowen that I realized how exceptional things are in New Zealand. I lived in New Zealand in the late 80s, and I was working there for about 6 months. And when I was done, my mother came out for a visit, and we traveled around the North and South Islands for a couple of weeks together. And one of the places that we went to was this town called Rotorua, and there was this place called the Agrodome. I'd been told by everyone I worked with, you got to go see, you got to go to this place. And so we saw sheepdog demonstrations, and then they had a shearing demonstration, and the guy did it in like a minute flat. We just couldn't believe how amazing that was. And so in all of the years since then, anytime I've seen someone shearing a sheep, no one has done it that quickly. And so I realize now that that's just a technique that was born in New Zealand, and of course they're showcasing the very fastest shearers as well at the Agrodome. But it's amazing. So I'm going to leave you some links down in the show notes, a couple of videos so you can see him shearing, and they have this voiceover narrator with a very, very proper British accent, and also the Wikipedia article about him, so you can see what the technique is and kind of learn it. And so then when you watch some of these other shearers that you might see on at festivals or on YouTube, you can recognize, oh, they're doing this exactly what it is that they're doing. So I just thought it was fascinating. He toured all over Europe and Russia demonstrating his technique back in, I think, the 60s. And the Russians were so amazed by him. They called him the Nureyev of sheep shearers, because it really is like a ballet when you see how he does it compared to, he just did it so effortlessly, and it's just amazing to watch. Back in July, when I was doing Tour de Fleece and challenging myself to incorporate spinning into my daily fiber life, my friend Elizabeth, who I give full credit to for guiding me into my love of spinning rather than just my sort of academic interest in it, she was telling me about a skein winder she had and how it worked. So it's a different piece of equipment than a niddy-noddy, which is what I have. And let me just go get that niddy-noddy. So this is one niddy-noddy that I have, and these rotate like this. So when you want to wind up yarn off of your bobbin, let me just get some regular yarn and I'll show you. You go through this circuit all the way around all 4 of these points. And so now I'm back around at the top. So it's gone all around, if you can get this in here, all around. It's made a whole route. That is 2 yards. So niddy-noddies all have a specific amount. Some of them are adjustable, so you can do different lengths, so that the hank that you're making is going to have this specific circumference. Like I have one right here that is 24 inches. So if I'm doing a small sample of yarn, I might wind it on this little niddy-noddy. Like I did a little sample right here and to make this little hank. So Elizabeth had this different type of skein winder, and I was asking her how it worked, and she's like, she thought it would help her shoulder more than the niddy-noddy, but it doesn't seem to be any better. What she really wanted to get was a Weasel, but it was hard to find one that still popped. And I thought, what? So immediately I am Googling, spinner's Weasel, and it's a really interesting piece of equipment. They're antiques. They look a lot like a Swift, like something that you'd put that hank on when you were winding it off into like a center pole ball, but it's on its side. So it's kind of like a Ferris wheel. So it's going around this way, and it would have a circumference of 2 yards, but it has a little piece of clockwork in it that allows it to count up to 40, so that you would have 80 yards in a skein. So you could make really even amounts of yardage in each skein. So if you were making yarn and you were selling it, or you just wanted to know exactly how much yardage something was, you could count up your skeins and you would know each one of those had 80 yards. So what happens when it gets to 80, it goes, makes this little popping sound. And I thought, this can't be a coincidence that there's a children's song called Pop Goes the Weasel. Now, if you're not a native English speaker, you probably don't have this children's song, but this is a song I heard all the time when I was a kid. And there's a lot of different versions, which I'll talk about, but the one that just came to my head was, all around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought it was all in good fun. Pop goes the weasel. There's some versions that it's all around the cobbler's bench. The monkey chased the weasel. It's the same thing. It was always a monkey chasing a weasel, and then pop goes the weasel. Like, what does that even mean? And so I started looking into the lyrics, and this was a really popular song back in the 19th century. And really, it had so many different verses, different versions. There were dances that went along with this particular song. And so there are a lot of people who've tried to figure out what the words mean. But in many ways, it's a nonsense song. But there are some people who think that it isn't a monkey that's chasing the weasel, it's the money chasing the weasel. Because there's a second verse. A penny for a spool of thread, a penny for a needle. That's the way the monkey goes, pop goes the weasel. But if you change that to money, that a penny for a spool of thread, a penny for a needle, that's the way the money goes, pop goes the weasel. So there's some people who think that it's talking about, laboring to make yarn to sell, and then you have to spend it, on threads and needles, and, that the money that you make is just going after the, expenditures. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So I'm going to leave a link down below to some information, including some videos of people who have these antique spinner's weasels, and you can hear the popping sound. As soon as I found out about it, it was one of those things like when I saw a great wheel, and I was like, which is, a type of spinning wheel. And I'm like, oh, I want to have one of those. And I'm like, no, I don't want to have one of those. I don't have room for it. Number one. And number two, I have other things that do that task, so I don't need it to accomplish that task. It's just I want to see one in person, maybe try it out, just see how it works, watch it in action. But that's really cool. So I'll leave you links to information about Pop Goes the Weasel, as well as seeing a spinner's weasel in action. So I have a couple of project updates, things that are just continuing in progress. One of them is that I have been spinning some yarn to make my first sweater from hand spun yarn. So I bought some fiber it's during Tour de Fleece, and I spun it into yarn, and I liked the yarn. So it was like, this is how I wanted this yarn to turn out. I was so pleased. And it's a local mill, and so I went down and I picked up some more. So this is the two skeins that I started with, and I bought some more of these braids. These braids each have 2 ounces of fiber. It's called WAM, wool alpaca mohair, and I think I bought six more of these. And so far, I have spun 3 of them up. So I have 3 spools, 3 very full spools. And so I'll probably get, I think I'll get 3 more skeins out of these. And then I have 3 more braids, and so I'll have another 3. And then, I've been thinking about what I want this sweater to be like. So that's been sitting in the back of my head. So that's an update on the hand spun. The other thing I wanted to give you an update on was the little toddler sweater I've been working on for the past couple of weeks. And the purpose of this sweater is actually to give me content for technique videos this fall. I have like 5, 6 or so videos planned around different elements of this sweater. And some of them are sweater techniques and some of them are just general knitting techniques, but I'm using the sweater to illustrate them. So if I was just knitting the sweater, it would be long done. But because I'm having to film technique videos that are associated with it, it's taking a little longer. But let's go to the overhead and I'll just show you what's going on with that right now. I have 3 videos that are going to be focusing on various finishing techniques, like picking up stitches around the neck and doing a bind off for twisted rib knitting, and then how to deal with these underarms so that you don't get holes at the edges. And so this is for a bottom up seamless sweater design. So for bottom up raglans or bottom up circulars. So I did a video about the underarms for top down circulars and raglans last year, which I'll leave a link to above and down in the show notes. But I just wanted to show you where I am. I'm nearly done, but until I can plan out the video exactly what I want to do and how I want to demonstrate it, I can't quite finish it. So it's probably going to take a little bit for me to actually have a finished sweater here, but I did want to give you an update. So when I started this little toddler sweater a few weeks back, I had a few questions about the yarn choices or the yarn behavior in the fabric, as well as just the choice of superwash wool and things that I took into consideration when making that selection for this sweater, and how is that maybe the same or different from considerations that people might want to make for an adult size sweater. So let's dive into that. This piece of knitting here was knit with some worsted weight wool that had 3 or 4 plies in it. So it's very much like this type of yarn right here. That was what was used to knit this swatch. And you'll see that the stitches have that familiar V shape. So the right legs go out to the right and the left legs go out to the left at pretty much the same angle. This is the fabric that I am getting with the yarn that I'm using for this toddler sweater. And so a couple of people commented on it wondering about this. And even my hairdresser was showing her the sweater and she noticed that appearance of the stitches, and she's not a knitter. What's going on here is that the yarn that is used for this to knit this fabric is not the same as this kind of plied yarn here. Superficially, it looks the same, but there are some differences. So let's take a look up close at what the yarn does look like. So if we look at this green one, if I take apart the plies in this green yarn, I can take them apart and we can see that there are 4 individual strands. Those were singles that were spun first. And then those 4 singles were put together and then they were plied. So when you are making the single, the fibers are going to get twisted in one direction or the other. And the direction that they are twisted will give them an appearance, either what they call a Z twist. So the twist angle will be like this knitting needle where it goes up to the right, or it will have what's called an S twist and it will go up to the left. And it has those names because if you look at the middle of those 2 letters, that main angled line of the letter S is angled in this direction and Z is angled in that direction. Most commercial yarns these days have the singles with a Z twist. When you twist the singles together, you twist them in the opposite direction, and that gives them the S twist. So you can see that S twist here. And what that does is when you're creating the single and you're twisting them in one direction, the fibers are actually angled in that direction. And then when you twist them together in the opposite direction, the strands are angled in this direction, but the fibers inside are all vertical. So they're all going vertically, and that's called a balanced yarn. And a yarn like this is going to give you those really even V-shaped stitches. If you work with a yarn like this really super bulky yarn here, this is just a single. It isn't applied yarn. So a bunch of fibers were held together and they were twisted in this direction, which gives it a Z twist. So if you knit with something like this, you are likely to get a stitch that is going to be asymmetrical. And for this, with this Z twist, the right leg is going to be vertical and the left leg is going to go off to the angle. So what's causing these stitches to have that left leg be vertical and the right leg be angled? Well, if we take apart this yarn and we look at all of the strands in here, what we see are there first of all, there's a lot more than 4 strands. I think there's 6 in here. But each one of these strands is a 2-ply. So the singles were very fine and they had a Z twist to them. And then 2 of them were plied together with an S twist. You can see that this twist angle goes up to the left. And then they took 6 of those 2-ply strands and they twisted them together, but they twisted them together to give it a final S twist. So we call this an S on S twist yarn or plied yarn. And sometimes it's just called a multi-strand yarn. So these yarns are typically made by mills that make commercial knitting yarns that are made for very fine gauge commercial knits. And they just combine those little 2-ply strands into a thicker yarn that can be used for hand knitting. Now, aside from creating asymmetrical stitches, the yarn is very, very round. And because this is superwash, it's very smooth. So what you get is really great stitch definition. So you can see every one of these individual stitches very clearly. Now, not everybody likes the way that these look, but you can see every stitch really, really clearly. And what it means for the stitch pattern that I'm using on the front of this sweater is that, you know, things like cables or these traveling twisted stitch patterns, they just really look great when you use a yarn like this. So it creates this really round yarn, this little twisted stitches riding along the surface of the pearls, and it's just really incredible. If I'd used a fuzzier yarn, if I'd used like a woolen spun yarn, where there isn't as good stitch definitions, that the stitches tend to kind of bleed into each other. They kind of blend into each other. That would, you'd still have this sort of embossed stitch pattern effect, but it just wouldn't be as clear. So that was one of the things that I like about this yarn. I don't typically choose this yarn, but when I do choose a yarn like this, I look at how it's constructed, and so I know what to expect from the stitches. So I know that this is what I'm going to get with that. Now, I have done some videos on yarn construction, including these kinds of yarns that create these asymmetrical stitches, and there's lots of swatches in there to kind of show you an up-close examination of what those yarns look like. So I'll leave links to that above and also down in the show notes in case you'd like to look at those videos and learn more about how these different yarn constructions can affect the knitted fabric. What I will say is that in those videos, in that video about the asymmetrical stitches, I got a number of comments from people who were so relieved to finally have an answer to why the fabric was doing that, but then wanted to know how they could make it not do that. Like, what can I do to make it not do that? And the answer is you can't. This is how that yarn behaves. So sometimes you can't make things not do what they're going to do in knitting. You just have to understand how knitting works, why it's behaving this way, and then when can you use that to your advantage, and when is it going to be a disadvantage, and then make your decision about the yarn at that time. So if you are, at a yarn shop and something looks really round and smooth like this, and you're not sure, well, how many plies does it have, you can just kind of untwist it and see how many are in there. And if you see many, many plies, it's probably one of these S on S plied yarns, and you can even look to see if the shop has a sample that was knit up with the yarn to confirm that that is what is going on. So I had several people ask me questions about the yarn and why it was having these asymmetrical stitches in it. They were wondering what causes that to happen. So that one question came from multiple people, but I also had one person ask multiple questions about my yarn choice, and more specifically about the choice of using superwash wool and how that can affect sweaters and what kinds of things you need to take into account when you are making a yarn selection for a project. Yarns, depending on how they're constructed, if it's superwash wool, non-superwash wool, if that non-superwash wool is worsted spun versus woolen spun, all of those things affect how much drape the fabric has. So sometimes you might want something that has more drape and sometimes you might not. When you are using different kinds of stitch patterns, you may need more sort of support from the construction method of the sweater. For example, I like making heavily cabled sweaters, like Aran sweaters, and that can cause you to use 30 or 40% more yarn for the sweater than you would if it were in stockinette. Because you just have so many more stitches, the gauge narrows down because stitches are crossing over each other. So additional stitches means additional weight. So what are you going to do to support that weight? One thing is, good shoulder seams. Another is working it to a firmer gauge so that the weight isn't going to cause the fabric to stretch out. So it might not stretch out in stockinette, but if you have a whole bunch of extra weight, that might cause it to stretch out. So you need to take into account what the construction of the sweater is all about, with the stitch patterns, what's being required of the yarn in the sweater construction in order to provide structure from several different places. So one of the places that the structure can come from is the yarn itself. So superwash wool isn't going to provide much structure. It's going to have a lot of drape. And you're going to be able to get a lot of beautiful tonal indie dyed colors because that type of yarn takes color so well. So if color is what's the most important thing to you, then you need to look at how the sweater is constructed that's going to support that yarn. If what you really love is the sweater itself and all of the components of it, then you need to look at those components and see where are you getting structure to hold that sweater up. And therefore, what sort of yarn is going to be most beneficial for this type of sweater? Shoulder seams are helpful. Having a neckline that isn't practically out to your shoulders is also helpful because the weight of the sweater is going to hangs from the shoulders. And if you have next to no shoulders on there, then that open neckline is just going to slide off your shoulders. So it can be helpful to add support on the wrong side of the fabric. You can do that after the fact. You can do slip stitch crochet along shoulders or along the back of the neck or along raglan seam lines, different places to help prevent that sort of stretch. I have a video on that sort of technique. If you use stranded color work, that has less stretch in it, just can't stretch as much. So that can be something that can help provide structure. Woolen spun yarns are just sort of have a lot of internal structure. They don't have much drape. And they can be good for things like stranded color work to give a painterly effect if you like that. It doesn't have as much stitch definition. So if the stitch pattern you have requires a lot of stitch definition, like with cables, woolen spun might not be the right thing, but worsted spun yarn would be a better choice. But maybe you need to work at a firmer gauge. So one of the questions about superwash was, do you need to work at a firmer gauge in order to get that support? You might if there's no support anywhere else from the sweater. So it just depends on what all of the different component pieces are. One thing that is really useful when you're looking at a pattern is don't just look at the yarn weight and then choose what color you like. Look at what specific yarn the designer chose and find out how that yarn is constructed. Is it a superwash wool? Is it a non-superwash that is worsted spun so it's still smooth and round, and has some drape, but maybe not as much as if it were superwash? Is it a woolen spun yarn? Is it a chainette yarn? That's another yarn that has like can have twice the yardage in the like in 50 grams or 100 grams than you'd get with something that was applied yarn. So if the yarn itself doesn't weigh as much, that's not going to weigh things down as much either. So you really need to look at all of the different component parts, what all is going on and combined together. Sometimes the designers will tell you what it is about the yarn. If they're telling you if you need to make a substitution, what to look for. If you don't know what to look for or they don't tell you, you can use a website like yarnsub.com, which will offer substitutions for whatever the yarn was that's called for in the pattern that are very close, that are nearly identical or very close. So you can figure out, what it is about this yarn. But sometimes you might get a designer who didn't take all of that into account, knit the sweater, wore it for the photos, and then is experiencing growth and problems after the fact. They can't wear the sweater themselves either. It just depends on how much you can trust that designer's choices, how experienced they are in making sure that they're choosing a yarn that works well for the pattern that they have designed. So these are a lot of things to think about, and how do you know? So if you have specific questions, I think this could be a really good topic of discussion for various different things. But yarn choice is not just about, is it the right thickness and is it the color that I want? There's a lot more going on with yarn construction, but not just the yarn. Also the project itself. What are those component pieces? How do they work together? And how do they need to interact with the yarn to get something that's going to hold its shape? When I was choosing the yarn for this little sweater, my considerations were a bit different from what the average knitter might be looking for. I knew that I was designing a sweater that I was going to use to demonstrate a variety of techniques on. So I was choosing, I wanted a V-neck, I wanted to have a stitch pattern in the front, I wanted something that was knit seamlessly bottom up so that I could do a video on the underarms. I wanted to use twisted ribbing because I wanted to demonstrate a bind-off technique for Knit One Pro One twisted ribbing. I had a whole list of things that I wanted to do. But I was knitting it for a toddler, and so I want something machine washable. So typically when I'm knitting for a child, I will choose machine washable, and that usually means a wool synthetic blend, or it means a superwash wool, one or the other. It just depends on what I find at whatever yarn shop I go to. The yarn shop that I happen to go to that's closest to me, mostly, as far as I can tell, carries natural fibers. And they might carry some blends, like they have sock yarns that have nylon in them. So obviously it's not like they don't allow any synthetics through their door. But the choices I was looking at were all machine washable. Some of them were machine dryable and some were not. So I picked one that was machine washable and machine dryable. And I was not worried about trying to compensate for the behavior of superwash wool. Like, I wasn't worried about the weight of the sweater. This is a toddler size sweater. Nothing is going to get stretched out. I've got a reasonable neck width. I am knitting at the recommended gauge. I'm not going firmer, but I'm not going looser. That's for sure. So I looked at all of those things, and then I had to choose a color that would photograph well, because some colors just don't do well on camera. So I knew I needed something that was kind of like a medium blue or medium green. Those tend to work really well for me. So again, those are not criteria that necessarily other people would be looking for. But that's what I was thinking about. And the superwash was not something I was trying to compensate for. And I did recognize that this yarn was an S-on-S ply, and I knew what kinds of stitches I was going to get, but I also knew that I was going to get some really great stitch definition in that twisted, traveling twisted stitch pattern panel that goes down the front. So let me know down in the comments if you have additional questions about this interaction of yarn choice and pattern choice, and I'll see if I can address those questions in upcoming videos. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.